The first thing I remember is Kyle's face. Pale, rigid, and furious. His voice was a low hiss, sharp enough to cut the sterile silence of the penthouse foyer. 22 minutes. Jana, you are 22 minutes late. That's how it began. The single most terrifying, humiliating, and ultimately validating night of my entire life. The night I walked into a lion's den expecting to be judged, and walked out with my entire future rewritten. But before that moment, before the cold fury and the silent, sterile foyer, there was an email. It arrived a week earlier. On a Tuesday afternoon, I was at my desk at school, grading papers, the room smelling like chalk dust and floor wax. My phone buzzed with an email, and I glanced at it. The sender was Blackwood Capital, and the subject line was just 2 words: dinner invitation. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. The email was a single, cold paragraph stating that Mrs. Judith Blackwood requested the presence of her son, Kyle, and his companion, Ms. Jenna Davis, for a formal dinner to finalize the new funding initiative. 7 p.m. Friday. Attendance required? No, we'd love to see you. No warmth. Just a command. I remember staring at it, the excited shouts of kids at recess outside my window fading into a dull roar. For 2 years, Kyle had been terrified of this moment. This dinner wasn't just a meet the mother, it was the meeting. The one where Kyle, a finance manager at his family's own VC firm, had to formally pitch his mother, the formidable Judith Blackwood, for a multi-million-dollar funding deal. His entire career, his sense of self-worth, was riding on this. That night, Kyle's anxiety was a living thing in our apartment. He paced, running his hands through his hair. Jenna, this is it. This is everything. If she funds this, I'm finally me. Not just her son. That's when he pulled out the box. It was flat, wrapped in old, cream-colored paper. Inside was a shawl. It was beautiful. I had to admit. Deep blue silk. So fine, it felt like water, with an intricate silver embroidery. It looked ancient. It was my grandmother's, he said. His voice hushed. It's vintage. Worth at least $1,200. He draped it over my shoulders. It felt heavy. Not with weight, but with expectation. Mother respects legacy, he said, smoothing the fabric. Oh, she respects things that last. This shows you get it. It's a prop. Jenna, it shows you're one of us. I just stood there, feeling like a doll being dressed. Then he looked at me, his eyes pleading. And Jenna? Please, tonight, can you just not be you? I flinched. What does that mean? It means, he said, don't talk about your school. Don't talk about your kids or the community. It's charity work. And she sees that as a weakness, a hobby for people who can't handle the real world. Let's stick to economics. Art. Just to be perfect. Please. Tonight has to be perfect. He kissed my forehead. But it felt cold. I looked at myself in the mirror. This $1,200 prop draped over my shoulders. I didn't see me. I saw a costume. A character I was being hired to play. And for the first time, I felt the crushing, suffocating weight of what it meant to love someone who was terrified of who you really were. I wasn't just anxious about the dinner. I was dreading the moment I'd have to pretend to be someone else. The night of the dinner, San Francisco unleashed one of those brutal, sideways rainstorms. The kind that feels personal. Of course. The taxi was gridlocked. Bumper to bumper. A sea of red taillights reflecting on the wet pavement. I looked at my phone. 7:30 p.m. Dinner was at 7:30. I was officially late. I'm getting out, I said to the driver, throwing cash onto the front seat. I can walk faster. He just grunted. I jumped out of the cab and into the storm. The wind instantly plastered my hair to my face and the cold rain soaked through my coat. I started to run, my heels sinking into the pavement, trying to protect the silk shawl under my jacket. I was only a few blocks from the penthouse. Just a blur of flashing don't walk signs and the hiss of tires. When I passed the bus stop, It was packed with people huddled under the small glass shelter. And even then, they were getting soaked. That's when I saw her. She was at the front of the line. An elderly woman, small and frail, wearing a thin coat that was completely useless against the wind. She was trying to pay for the bus, fumbling with a transit card. The driver kept shaking his head. Declined. Ma'am, you gotta have fare. I thought it had money on it, she whispered, her voice trembling. She started digging in a worn-out purse, her fingers stiff with cold. Coins spilled onto the wet sidewalk. Behind her, people sighed. A man in a suit muttered, "Come on, lady. Some of us have to get home." I glanced at my phone. 7:40 p.m. I was already 10 minutes late. 10 minutes could be explained. 20. 30. That was a declaration of war. Kyle's voice was a blade in my head. Be perfect. Be on time. Don't be you. She sees charity as weakness. I could just walk past. Keep my head down. I could be at the penthouse in 3 minutes. Apologize profusely. And maybe, save the night. I looked back at her. Her face was crumpled in humiliation. She wasn't just cold, she was terrified. She was invisible. And in that moment, I didn't care about the funding. I didn't care about the penthouse. I didn't care about being perfect. I walked over to her. "It's okay," I said, my voice coming out stronger than I expected. "I'll get it." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with confusion. "Oh, no, dear. I didn't wait." I pulled out my card and tapped it on the reader. The light flashed green. "Thank you." "Thank you," she whispered, her hand shaking as she held the railing. I looked at her, shivering, the wind whipping her thin coat. And then I looked at the $1,200 prop I was clutching. I didn't even think. I pulled the silk shawl from under my coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The silk immediately darkened in the rain. "But I didn't care." She gasped. "No, that's beautiful. I can't." "Please," I said, tucking it around her neck. "You need it more than I do." The bus was still waiting. But I looked at her, then at the rain, then at the line of impatient faces. She wasn't going to be warm for long. I stepped back into the street and hailed a taxi. The first one I saw. It screeched to a halt. I opened the back door, gently helped the woman inside. And she looked at me like I was an alien. I pulled out my wallet. It was all the cash I had. $192.50. I shoved it all into the driver's hand. "This is for her fare," I said. "And please, use the rest to buy her a new monthly pass when you drop her off." The woman was crying now, silent tears rolling down her face. "God bless you," she whispered. The taxi pulled away, disappearing into the storm. I stood there for a second, completely soaked. No coat. No shawl. My dress splattered with mud from the street. The bus pulled away, splashing me as it went. I looked at my phone. The screen was cracked with rain. 7:52 p.m. I was 22 minutes late. I had just given away a $1,200 legacy item and $192.50 to a total stranger. I had failed every single one of Kyle's tests. I had been exactly myself. And as I stood there, freezing and drenched, I felt the strangest sense of calm. I had made my choice. Now, I just had to face the consequences. I took a deep breath, and I ran the rest of the way to the penthouse. I buzzed the intercom. There was a cold, electronic click, and the heavy glass door slid open. The foyer was silent. It was less a home than a museum lobby. The floors were polished white marble that reflected the single, cold piece of art on the wall. The air smelled like polish and, I don't know, nothing. Like expensive, empty air. And Kyle was there, just standing, waiting. He wasn't running toward me. He wasn't asking if I was okay. He was just standing, his arms crossed, his face pale and tight. "Jenna," he said. His voice was flat. "Look at you. You're a mess. Your hair is. You're wet." "Kyle." I ran. The traffic was horrible. The storm. Wipe your shoes, he said, gesturing to a mat I hadn't even seen. We're already late. She's waiting. I just stared at him. Not. Are you safe? Not. May God? You must be freezing. Just. Wipe your shoes. I did. I felt like a child being scolded. As I straightened up, his eyes scanned me. Up and down. And his face got even tighter. I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. Where? He said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. Is the shawl. My stomach dropped. Kyle. Where is it? Jenna. I gave it to someone. I said quietly. There was an elderly woman at the bus stop. She was freezing. Kyle. She had no coat. She couldn't pay her fare. The wind was. I had to. He looked at me. He just looked at me. And in that 1 second, I saw the man I thought I loved completely disappear. He was gone. What was left was this. This stranger. His face twisted into a mask of disbelief and a cold, white, hot fury I had never seen before. You. What, he whispered. I gave it to her. And I paid for her taxi. He exploded. It wasn't loud. It was worse. It was a vicious, controlled hiss. You gave away a $1,200 family heirloom, my grandmother's shawl. You gave it away. To a stranger. On the street? She was cold. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to be here, he shot back. You were supposed to be on time. You were supposed to be wearing that shawl. Do you have any idea what you've done that was legacy? Jenna, that was the one thing you were supposed to do to show you respect this family. It's a piece of fabric. Kyle, that was a person. It wasn't just a piece of fabric, he snapped, his voice cracking with panic. That was my future. That was the multi-million-dollar deal. That was my mother. And you walk in here looking like that. Covered in rain. With some story about a charity case. He used that word, charity case. The one he'd warned me about. And he threw it at me like a rock. He stepped back, looking at me with a kind of final, cold disgust. The indignation I'd felt on the street was gone. Now, all I felt was a deep, hollow ache. He was truly, deeply ashamed of me. You, he said, his voice final. You've just proven it. You've just proven you don't belong here. That was it. That was the line. The line that proved he wasn't the man I thought he was. Before I could even answer. Before I could cry. Before I could do anything. A new voice cut through the foyer. It was sharp, clear, and cold as ice. Kyle. You're late. Judith Blackwood was standing in the doorway to the dining room. Her arms were crossed. Hair, expression, unreadable. She had heard every single word. The room was absolutely silent. I could hear the hiss of the rain against the floor to ceiling windows, 30 stories above the city. I could hear the tiny, panicked breaths of Kyle, who was staring at his mother. His face completely, totally blank. He just didn't understand. He looked from her to me and back to her. Mother. What? Kyle's voice was a dry croak. What are you talking about? You? You were at a bus stop. In the rain. That's insane. You're Judith Blackwood. Judith didn't even look at her son. Her eyes, which I had thought were so cold, were now different. They were still piercing. But they weren't cold. They were searching. And they were fixed on me. She slowly reached down to the empty chair beside her. The one Kyle was supposed to be sitting in. She picked something up from the seat. It was the $1,200 vintage silk shawl. It was damp, but clean, and perfectly folded. My heart stopped. Kyle made a small, choking sound. Judith held the shawl, running the fine silk between her fingers. This did belong to my mother, she said. Her voice quiet, but it filled the entire sterile room. You were right, Kyle. It's a legacy item. She looked at her son, and her expression was something I had never seen before. It was a deep, profound disappointment. But you don't even know what that legacy is. She looked back at me. My mother. Your grandmother. Kyle was a social worker in this city for 40 years. She worked in the Tenderloin. She spent her entire life helping the people everyone else just stepped over. The addicts. The runaways. The women at the bus stops with no fare. Kyle was shaking his head, as if trying to block out the words. I don't. When she died? Judith continued, her voice hardening. She died with nothing. Nothing but this shawl. A stack of unpaid bills. And about 20 people at her funeral who couldn't have afforded a cup of coffee. And I was so ashamed of her. The admission hung in the air. Heavy and raw. I was ashamed of her weakness. Judith said, her gaze distant, looking out at the city lights. I was ashamed of her charity. So I built this. She gestured around the room. At the art. The glass. The view. I built an empire from scratch. I became ruthless. I swore. I would never be weak. I would never be. Her. She folded the shawl, placing it on the table in front of her. And then, about 10 years ago, I realized I had become the one thing my mother would have been ashamed of. She looked at Kyle. So, yes. I do this test. Once a month. I put on her old coat. I go out into the city. Not as Judith Blackwood, the VC, but as her. As the invisible old woman at the bus stop. I do it to see if I've forgotten where I come from. If I've forgotten what real value is. Her eyes finally, landed on her son. And they were ice again. And I do it to see if my son, the man I raised, has forgotten. Too? The air in the room was so thin, it was unbreathable. Kyle just stared at his mother. His face, a mask of waxy, uncomprehending horror. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Judith's gaze, cold and heavy as a banker's vault, settled on her son. You failed. Kyle. The words were quiet, but they hit him like a physical blow. He flinched. You failed. She continued, her voice clinical. Because you stood right here. In this room. And you looked at this shawl. This legacy. And all you saw was a prop. A $1,200 tool to close a deal. She picked up the silk and held it out. You saw an item. Judith turned her gaze to me. And the ice in her eyes thawed. Just a little. She saw a person. Kyle finally found his voice. It was a desperate, pleading stammer. Mother. No. I wanted to make you proud. I wanted this. I wanted the funding. I did this for you. To show you I was like you. Strong. He was unraveling. The polished, perfect man in the foyer was gone. And in his place was a terrified little boy, begging for approval. I thought you wanted me to be perfect, I thought. I thought you'd be angry. And as I watched him crumble, a strange thing happened. The white-hot indignation I'd felt in the foyer just evaporated. I wasn't angry at him anymore. I was just sad. I suddenly saw him. Really saw him. He wasn't evil. He wasn't even just weak. He was a product. A perfectly engineered product of a toxic system. All his life. He hadn't been raised. He'd been managed. He was living in what psychologists call the golden handcuffs. A life so full of privilege, but so empty of meaning, that he was a prisoner of it. His mother hadn't given him love. She'd given him transactions. Good grades got him a new car. The right internship got him approval. This funding wasn't just a deal, it was his next hit. His next proof of love. He'd spent 30 years in a Skinner box, pressing a lever, desperate for the next pellet of validation. His cruelty to me wasn't a flaw. It was a conditioned response. He was just as trapped as the woman at the bus stop, just in a much more expensive and much colder prison. You don't get the funding. Kyle. Judith said. Her voice was flat. Final. The deal is off. Kyle just collapsed. He sank into the chair, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking in the awful, sterile silence. The collapse of his entire world, right there on a polished marble floor. Judith watched him for a moment, her face unreadable. Then, she turned her back on her son. She turned to me. She took a step closer. And for the first time, she really looked at me. Not as a test. Not as a problem. As a person. "I'm sorry, Jenna," she said. And her voice was soft. "I'm sorry for the test. But I had to know. I had to know if he had any of her left in him." She glanced at her son. "He doesn't." She looked back at me. "But you do." She picked up the silk shawl from the table and held it out to me. "This is yours. My mother would have wanted you to have it." I shook my head, my throat tight. I can't. That's your legacy. Judith." "No," she said, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "You're wrong. That." She pointed at Kyle's shaking form. "That is my legacy. The one I built. The one I'm ashamed of." She looked back at me, her eyes sharp again. But this time, it was the sharpness of a CEO, of a venture capitalist. "But I think it's time to build a new one. I'm not investing in his new app. The world doesn't need another way to trade stocks." She took another step toward me. "I'm investing in you. In your charity work. So, tell me, Jenna, how much would it cost to fix the leaky roof at that school you're not supposed to talk about?" The next 6 months were a sunrise, slow and quiet, and full of a light I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The first check from the new legacy grant from Blackwood Capital came 3 days later. It wasn't just for the leaky roof. It was enough to rebuild the entire school library. New books, new computers, new chairs that weren't cracked and held together with duct tape. I spent my days covered in paint dust and my nights organizing boxes of donated books. And for the first time in my life, my work felt seen. Kyle was there, too. Not at first. He disappeared for about a week. When he came back, he was smaller, quieter, humbled. He showed up at the school one Saturday, not in a $1,000 suit, but in old jeans and a sweatshirt. He didn't say much. He just picked up a paintbrush and started on the west wall. We painted in silence for an hour. Then, he finally stopped, looked at me, and said, "I'm sorry, Jenna. Not for the deal. For everything. For making you feel small. For being so afraid." And we started talking. Really talking. Not about funding. Or legacy. Or impressing anyone. We talked about his grandmother. The social worker. We talked about my kids. We started, slowly, to rebuild. When our wedding day came, it wasn't in the cold glass penthouse overlooking the city. We got married in the new school library. It was simple. Just a few friends. My parents. And all my kids. Who were dressed up and trying not to run around. The room smelled like new books and fresh paint. Judith was there. She wasn't in a power suit. She wore a simple, soft blue dress. And over her shoulders, she wore the $1,200 vintage silk shawl. It wasn't a prop anymore. It was a badge of honor. It was her mother's legacy. Finally brought home. She walked up to me before the ceremony. And she just squeezed my hand. "She would have loved this," she whispered, her eyes shining. "She would have loved you." As I stood there, watching Kyle say his vows, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes on mine. Finally seeing me, I looked at Judith. And at the shawl. And at the kids in the front row. And I realized that night in the rain hadn't been a test of my character. It had been a test of theirs. If you're listening to this, if you've ever been in a room and felt like the outsider, the one who isn't rich enough, or polished enough, or ruthless enough, I want you to know something. It's not because you don't belong. It's because your values are too big to fit inside their small, cold rooms. It's not a weakness. It's your greatest strength. Don't you ever shrink to fit. Don't let them make you feel small for having a heart that's too big. The world doesn't need more perfect people. It needs more real ones. Stay kind. Stay exactly as you are.